Welcome to the deep dive. Tonight, a political earthquake. It's really the only way to describe it.
Absolutely. The reports coming out of Minneapolis are just staggering. We're talking about a massive federal surge that seemingly came out of nowhere.
And not just any surge. I mean, the sources you sent over, they're describing a full deployment. We're talking ICE, DHS task forces, joint intel units, the works. They swarmed Minneapolis in December of 2025.
And the fallout was immediate. This wasn't just a law enforcement action, it was a political statement.
Yeah.
The sources claim it ripped the lid off a systemic, quiet amnesty pipeline.
A quiet amnesty pipeline. That's the term they're using, and it's what we have to unpack tonight. Our mission is to dissect these claims, to look at the fraud, the national security risks this allegedly exposed, and the political chaos that has just exploded across the entire country because of it.
Exactly. We're looking at what the sources describe as an operation carried out with absolute precision. No leaks. And it goes so far beyond just executing warrants. It's about exposing a structure, a bureaucratic framework that was allegedly built to fail.
And that's the devastating part. The claim is this exposed terror watch list entries. People on the watch list tied to migrant routes and fraud networks that have been running for years.
And connected directly back to DHS memos that were apparently buried, but not anymore. This is the beginning of a massive nationwide reckoning.
So that's our deep dive tonight. We're going to expose the full truth based on the sources we have. If you want the news they don't want you to hear, hit that subscribe button right now.
Let's start with the first domino.
Yeah, why Minneapolis?
Okay, so December 2025, this wasn't a random raid. The sources paint this as a calculated strategic first move, a massive coordinated surge.
You said largest in decades for Minnesota. That's a huge claim. We're talking ICE strike teams, DHS tactical units, FBI support.
The scale's the first clue. This wasn't about chasing a few leads. This was designed for shock and awe and for maximum operational security.
Meaning no leaks.
Exactly. The sources are very clear. This thing went down overnight with no leaks, no hesitation. That tells you it was a high-level maneuver, something that completely bypassed the usual DC chatter and media spin.
So that brings us back to the question. Out of all the cities in the country, why Minneapolis? Why hit Ilhan Omar's political fortress, a known sanctuary city, first?
It all comes down to the intelligence. The sources claim President Trump's internal briefings painted a picture of Minnesota that was, frankly, terrifying.
Yeah.
Far worse than anything being admitted publicly.
What was in those briefings? What made Minneapolis ground zero?
Three things.
Right.
Primarily, first, what they called exploding fraud networks.
Yeah.
Highly organized, operating with what seemed like total impunity.
Okay.
Second, evidence of shell nonprofits. We're talking organizations that were allegedly moving millions and millions of dollars completely under the radar.
And the third.
The most alarming piece. Foreign nationals who were reportedly slipping through enforcement cracks. But the key here is that the intel suggested these cracks weren't accidental. They were allegedly created intentionally by policy directives years earlier.
Wait. Shell nonprofits moving millions, that's not just some small-time scam. That's a sophisticated financial operation. You're saying it was able to grow because of the political environment there.
That's what the intelligence suggested, that the political cover and the sanctuary policies created an enforcement vacuum. And this fraud ecosystem didn't just grow in that vacuum, it thrived. It became highly organized.
So Minneapolis was basically the perfect petri dish.
It was the logical ground zero for a major intervention. And politically, the shockwave was instant. I mean, the entire progressive machine, the sanctuary apparatus, they were completely blindsided.
They never saw it coming.
Not at this level. This action sent a message to every other sanctuary city in the country. The game has changed. This wasn't a warning shot. It was a demonstration of force aimed at dismantling an entire operational structure.
Bypassing the bureaucracy, no media notice. I get it. It was strategic. It was designed to expose the root of the problem.
Which brings us to the blueprint, the documents they allegedly found in those DHS archives.
Right. So this is where it gets really chilling. We move from the action on the ground in Minneapolis to the policy that allegedly allowed all of this to happen.
Exactly. According to the sources, the big discovery, the smoking gun, came when the new administration started digging into the DHS archives. They found what's being called a detailed blueprint for a massive quiet amnesty pipeline.
Hold on. Let's be really clear here. This isn't a law that was passed by Congress. This isn't something that was debated publicly. The claim is this was internal guidance.
Internal guidance, memos,
Yeah.
directives, precisely. The sources claim it was a system designed to functionally nullify immigration law without anyone in the public ever knowing.
How? What were the mechanisms they used?
The sources detail a few specific bureaucratic tools. The biggest one was a massive expansion of something called humanitarian parole. Then there were deferred enforcement memos and specific internal guidance sent out to field officers.
Okay, let's break that down. Humanitarian parole. I think most people hear that and think it's for, a true emergency, a political refugee fleeing persecution.
And that's its legal intent. It's an authority to grant temporary entry for urgent humanitarian reasons or for a significant public benefit. But the sources claim that under the prior administration, that authority was, well, it was stretched far beyond its original meaning.
Stretch how?
It was allegedly applied broadly to large groups of people for reasons that were, you could argue, more about economics or just convenience. It became a tool to bypass the standard, much more rigorous visa and vetting processes.
So a legal loophole is basically turned into a superhighway to let people in without the normal security checks.
That's the allegation. And then you have a second tool, deferred enforcement memos. These are critical. These memos, according to the sources, specifically instructed officers in the field to deprioritize, and that's the key word, deprioritize entire categories of removable migrants.
Deprioritize, what does that actually mean on the ground?
It means people who might have, say, low-level fraud indicators or nonviolent criminal histories were no longer a priority for removal. Their files were effectively put on the back burner indefinitely.
Wait, hold on a second. This is the part I can't get my head around. This wasn't just, an accident. It wasn't just being overwhelmed with cases. The source is claiming that DHS actively re-engineered the entire system.
That's the core of it. The re-engineering is the central claim. It's not that they passively lost control. It's that they allegedly created an internal process designed to slow or completely stop removals for huge groups of people.
It's a de facto amnesty. It's granting them the ability to stay here long-term without actually calling it amnesty.
Think of it like this. Deprioritizing a case is like moving a file from the active removals desk and putting it into deep storage in an archive somewhere.
Yeah.
Is that person still technically removable? Yes.
But no one's ever going to look for that file.
Not unless they commit a new major crime. For all practical purposes, that person becomes invisible to IC's field offices. The system, allegedly, was performing exactly as it was redesigned to perform. And the sources say this is the direct explanation for why those fraud networks were exploding and why ICE officers had these impossible backlogs.
So this changes everything. This isn't a story about bureaucratic incompetence. It's a story about what the sources claim were intentional policy choices.
With widespread and very dangerous consequences.
What was the evidence? I mean, was it just the memos themselves, or was there more?
It was more. The memos were the blueprint, but the proof came from whistleblower testimony.
People from inside DHS.
Yes. Career officials, some with decades of service, who allegedly came forward under oath. They testified about the real-world impact of these directives. They said they were pressured, from the top down.
Pressure to do what? What did they say their supervisors were telling them?
The testimony, as described in the sources, it's damning. They claim they were actively discouraged from pursuing certain removal cases, even when the cases had multiple red flags.
What kind of red flags?
Things like fraud, clear identity inconsistencies, even known associations with criminal elements. But the most shocking claim, they said supervisors ordered staff to just close files outright.
Close them. Not just put them on the back burner, but close them.
Close them. To artificially reduce the backlog statistics and make the numbers look better, even if it meant completely ignoring serious fraud indicators or criminal ties.
Just to make a spreadsheet look good.
The sources allege it was systemic obstruction of law enforcement, using statistics as a weapon for policy. These officials felt they had to look the other way.
So you have the memos as the policy justification and the whistleblowers as proof of how it was implemented on the ground.
And that combination is what allegedly gave the new administration the justification they needed for the massive federal action in Minneapolis. The policy created the vacuum, and the testimony proved the vacuum was intentional.
Which brings us to the part that affects everyone listening. This wasn't just about paperwork. It was a national security breach hiding in plain sight.
That's the ultimate danger here. Because the sources claim that multiple migrants connected to these networks in Minnesota had already been flagged. flagged with terror watch list indicators.
And their cases were just sitting there.
Stalled.
Mm-hmm.
Deprioritized. Not because agents missed them, but because the policy allegedly told those agents to focus their limited resources somewhere else. It allowed known risks to just stay embedded in the community, shielded by a bureaucratic memo.
So when the administration saw that data people with active terror watch list indicators living freely in the Twin Cities because their files were intentionally dormant, that's when they decided to act.
That's what the sources suggest. That level of vulnerability, hidden by administrative procedure, is why Minneapolis was first. It was a 5-alarm fire.
Okay, so the Amnesty pipeline creates this vacuum, and crime rushes in to fill it. Let's talk about the sheer scale of the fraud they uncovered.
The sources are pretty explicit that this was a sophisticated ecosystem of crime that had been, for the most part, ignored by the mainstream media.
Mm-hmm.
And the blueprint for all of it was one scandal that people might remember.
The Feeding Our Future scandal.
Exactly. The sources claim Feeding Our Future wasn't a one-off scheme. It was the roadmap. It was the proof of concept for all the other criminal activity that came later.
Remind us how that worked. It was about billing for meals for kids that didn't exist, right?
At its core, yes. Bad actors set up dozens of shell nonprofits and phantom food distribution sites. They looked legitimate on paper. Then they'd bill the federal government for, hundreds of thousands of meals they claimed to be serving to children every single day.
Meals that were never made.
Never made, never served. This taught the criminal networks a vital lesson. You can use the structure of a legitimate nonprofit and manipulate federal grant reporting to siphon off huge amounts of public money.
So basically hide the crime behind a banner of social good, especially in an environment where enforcement is weak and you can scale up fast.
And the sources claim they applied that model everywhere. It became a spiderweb of fraud.
What other areas?
The list is pretty long. Pervasive Medicaid and housing scams where they'd bill for phantom residents or services that were never provided, fake youth programs that were just fronts to get state and local grants, and a huge one was daycare billing fraud.
How did that work?
Providers allegedly billing the state for phantom children who weren't enrolled, or for charging for extended hours that kids never attended. It shows a comprehensive, very calculated effort to exploit any social welfare program they could get their hands on.
This sounds less like random crime and more like organized crime, a professional operation. Do we have any numbers on the scale of this?
We do, and they're staggering. In the Feeding Our Future model alone, there were cases of billing for up to 6,000 phantom meals a day.
6,000 a day.
Per site, in some cases. Now imagine applying that organizational skill to Medicaid or housing grants. The dollar figures become astronomical. The sources also cite claims that a lot of this money was being routed overseas through complex wire transfers.
And the most infuriating part,
The fact that repeat offenders, people who were caught doing this before, were somehow able to get new grants and start all over again.
how is that even possible? It suggests, I don't know, a system that was either completely indifferent or was actively providing a political cover?
The sources point to political cover. When the signal from the top, from the federal level, is that this kind of enforcement isn't a priority, state and local agencies tend to follow that lead, it creates a permissive environment.
An environment where these networks feel untouchable.
And according to the sources, several of these nonprofits that previously felt untouchable are now facing intense federal scrutiny.
But this wasn't just about white-collar crime. The feds made a direct link between this fraud and violent crime, right?
That was the strategic pivot. The FBI started reopening cold cases. Specifically, files on Somali gang activity that had been quietly deprioritized for years.
Why? What's the connection?
The connection is money. The vast financial resources they were getting from these fraud schemes were directly funding the operations of organized violent crime groups.
We've heard warnings about this for years, about the connection between certain networks and the violence in the Twin Cities.
We have. Local lawmakers have been sounding the alarm, pointing out that a huge percentage of violent crime was tied to a very small group of these organized networks. But the sources claim the previous approach was often to downplay the problem, to focus on political narratives instead of the hard data.
And now agents are going back. They're using the fraud arrest to reopen the violent crime cases. What are they finding?
They're finding the links. They're cross-referencing suspects arrested for fraud with their known criminal associates. They're re-interviewing witnesses who were too scared to talk before. And most importantly, they're analyzing the financial data they seized.
And the money trail doesn't lie.
It doesn't. The sources claim it confirms a structured, highly coordinated pattern of criminal activity. They're tracking money moving in ways that don't match anyone's declared income. They are confirming, in black and white, the structural links between the fraud schemes and known gang members. They're cutting off the money to dismantle the entire operation.
The moment that federal surge hit, the city it erupted.
The political reaction was instantaneous and extreme, and you really see it in the response from Representative Ilhan Omar.
She was on every news channel imaginable immediately.
She was, and her message was consistent. This was racism, targeting, and fear-mongering. She framed the entire operation not as a legitimate crackdown on crime and fraud, but as a political attack against her and her community.
But the sources suggest that the panic in her response told a different story. I mean, her political power base was suddenly under direct assault in her own district.
It's a stark contrast. This is a politician who was often projected an image of being untouchable, but now the walls were shaking. The sources draw a line between her past confidence and this new, very defensive posture. It was a signal to everyone who relied on that old system of weak enforcement that the protection was gone.
And the rhetoric from other community leaders was just as extreme. They were telling people to carry their documents, comparing the situation to 1930s Germany.
That kind of rhetoric spreads fear like wildfire, and it creates this impossible situation for residents. On one hand, you have community leaders telling you federal agents are the enemy. On the other, you have federal authorities saying they're targeting serious criminals and terror risks. Who do you trust?
It's a deliberate muddying of the waters. And this chaos didn't just stay in Minneapolis, it went national. Fast, especially with the sanctuary cities.
This is what the sources call the sanctuary cities betrayal. It was a stunning reversal. Mayors from New York, Chicago, Denver, Boston.
All places that had championed being sanctuary cities.
Exactly. And suddenly, they were on TV one after another saying they were completely overwhelmed, they were broke, they couldn't handle the influx of migrants anymore.
They saw what happened in Minnesota and realized they were next.
They saw the writing on the wall. They understood that the so-called quiet amnesty pipeline had been funneling thousands of people into their cities. People who, under normal protocols, would have been detained or removed. Their systems were collapsing under the weight of it.
So the blame shifted.
Dramatically. Instead of blaming Trump for enforcement, they started blaming the prior administration for the lack of enforcement and for creating the crisis in the first place.
But the most shocking moment, the point of actual open rebellion, came from the Minneapolis police chief.
It's an unbelievable move. The police chief stepped in, not to support federal law enforcement, but to actively warn residents to call 911 if they saw ICE agents.
He told them to call 911 on federal agents.
He advised the community to assume it might be a kidnapping. Not lawful immigration enforcement, but kidnapping.
That's inciting obstruction. It creates a direct conflict between local and federal authorities and puts civilians and officers on both sides in incredible danger.
It's an extraordinary jurisdictional showdown. Federal officials were, of course, furious. The sources cite former ICE Director Tom Homan, who called it shameful and publicly warned that any local officer who obstructs a federal operation could face federal prosecution themselves.
So at the very moment these terror watch list revelations are surfacing, the local police chief is telling people to resist federal arrests.
It's an unprecedented act of defiance.
Yeah.
And you can be sure that Washington was watching every single second of it and taking notes.
So Washington sees this chaos, this open rebellion, and they have the evidence of this alleged amnesty pipeline. What was the strategic response?
It was swift and it was comprehensive. The sources say the Trump administration rolled out what they're calling a new immigration war doctrine. The term being used internally is a whole-of-government strike.
A whole-of-government strike. What does that mean in practice? It sounds like it's designed to just steamroll all the bureaucratic red tape that caused this problem.
That's the exact goal. It's a synchronized campaign designed to eliminate all the choke points. It's not just ICE acting alone. They brought in the DEA, the ATF, the FBI, Homeland Security investigations, and federal prosecutors from multiple districts, all working as one unit.
So they hit a target simultaneously, with every agency ready to act on what they find.
Precisely. The process was designed for ruthless efficiency. If they're serving a warrant and they find legal drugs, the DEA takes over that part of the case on the spot.
No waiting for another agency to get a warrant.
None. If they find illegal weapons, the ATF files charges immediately. If the main issue is the grant fraud, the DOJ seizes the financial records and prosecutes. And then, the most critical part? After the criminal case is filed, ICE begins removal proceedings with absolutely no delay.
No delay. That's the key. That closes the loop that allowed people to be arrested, post bail, and then just disappear back into the community for years while their case sat in a backlog.
It creates a seamless pipeline from criminal prosecution straight to administrative removal. The sources are calling it the most aggressive, synchronized enforcement campaign Minnesota has ever seen. And the message it sent went far beyond the Twin Cities.
And that message is, what? If you're a sanctuary city, your policies won't protect these networks anymore.
The message is that the era of protected networks, ignored fraud, and buried cases is over. By linking every single immigration violation to every possible criminal charge, drugs, guns, fraud, they make the case for removal legally airtight and almost impossible for local courts to block.
So this Minnesota operation wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a national realignment. What are the consequences we're seeing across the country now?
The shockwaves are everywhere. First, as we discussed, sanctuary cities are bracing for impact. They know their policies have made them prime targets for this new federal strike force.
States must be rethinking their positions, too.
They are. The sources say states are quietly rewriting their cooperation agreements with federal authorities. The old model of non-cooperation is suddenly looking politically and legally toxic.
What about in Congress? Is there a legislative response to close these policy loopholes?
Yes. Congressional committees are reportedly drafting new enforcement legislation that would have been unthinkable just a couple of years ago. The goal is to permanently close the loopholes and remove the administrative discretion that allowed for this deprioritization in the first place, to take it out of the hands of bureaucrats.
And for the networks themselves, the nonprofits and shell companies.
They're terrified. Nonprofits that get large government grants, organizations that never thought they'd face a federal audit, are reportedly lawyering up across the country. They're afraid the Minneapolis model of linking fraud to organized crime is coming for them next.
Even the politicians who supported these policies are backing away now.
The political fallout is massive. Even Democratic governors who are feeling the pressure from their own overwhelmed cities and angry voters are starting to distance themselves from the sanctuary policies they used to champion. They see the political winds have shifted, and they don't want to be the next Minneapolis.
So when we put it all together, the Minnesota surge wasn't just about Minnesota.
Not at all. It was monumental because it exposed how this alleged quiet amnesty pipeline had fundamentally changed immigration enforcement across the entire country. The crackdown didn't just clean up a local problem, it kicked off a nationwide reckoning.
It proved the biggest vulnerability wasn't just at the southern border. It was deep inside the bureaucracy itself, hidden in memos and spreadsheets.
And that's the truly chilling part. It revealed how fragile the system was, how a few small, non-public changes to internal guidance could effectively nullify huge chunks of federal law, allowing people with serious red flags to just blend into the background, protected by the system itself.
So the real question now isn't about what happened, it's about what happens next. If Minnesota was the first domino, which state is next?
Which political fortress is the next target for this whole-of-government strike? And more importantly, how many buried cases, how many ignored red flags, how many fraud schemes, how many potential security risks are going to explode into public view when the feds open the next set of files in that state? This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a total reset of enforcement policy in America.
That's the reality we're facing. And when you have a local police chief telling residents to treat federal agents like they might be kidnappers, it forces you to ask a really fundamental question. I want to know what you think. When local and federal authorities are in open conflict on your streets, who do you trust to keep you safe? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. We read every single one. I'm host speaker.
And I'm expert speaker. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.